Now, for those who are not familiar with my preaching style, I generally do a sermon series of about 5 sermons per book. Instead of focusing on individual passages or focusing on topics, I focus on books. And this would be the first sermon in a series of Proverbs. Now, before the whole COVID-19 thing happened, we were going through the book of 2 Corinthians, but I'm putting that on hold for the sake of this video series so we can do a series that is on the video in its entirety. And we're also doing the book of Proverbs because the book of Proverbs is easily interrupted as far as books go. And I was planning also already to do the book of Proverbs. Now, when we look at the book, the vast majority of the book of Proverbs are individual little passages, individual little proverbs that stand on their own. But when we start at the beginning of the book, we get a long treatise about the importance of wisdom, the greatness of wisdom. And even this treatise is preceded by a small little poem about how great wisdom is. And this poem introduces the book, establishes a few things about the nature of wisdom. Number one, that wisdom comes from listening to the wise. For instance, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, the Proverbs come from Solomon. And it says, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. To a wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel, to understand a proverb and an enigma. So the understanding of wisdom is attained through listening, through hearing words from the wise. The second point. So first is that wisdom comes from listening to the wise. Second, that wisdom is based off of respecting God. In verse 7 it says, the fear of the Lord, which means respecting the Lord, is the beginning of all knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. Wisdom comes not just simply from listening to the wise, but specifically respecting and pursuing the truth of God and the mind of God. And the third point is that wisdom accomplishes righteousness, justice, fairness, and prudence. Now, in the translation I read earlier, it says justice, judgment, and equity, but better translations for those words are righteousness, justice, and fairness. And also, prudence is the fourth one given. And these are the things that wisdom are set out to accomplish. That is their goal. Now, the book of Proverbs is, as I said before, about wisdom. And the Hebrew word for wisdom is the word chokhmah, which is, I think, one of the most fun words to say that I've ever heard in my entire life. I just love saying that, chokhmah, the chokhmah of God. You know, and you'll find that this treatise that I was mentioning before goes on from chapter 1 all the way into chapter 8. And it takes these 3 points that I mentioned before, and it repeats them over and over and over again. These are common themes throughout this entire section. Now, let us talk a little bit about what wisdom is. Wisdom is not the same thing as knowledge, and it is not the same thing as intelligence. Knowledge is simply knowing facts and data. Intelligence is being able to take what you know and to come to a correct conclusion about it. But wisdom is knowing the right thing to do at the right time. In fact, the Hebrew word also can mean skill. And the way that you improve each of these things are different. You improve knowledge primarily through study and hard work. You improve intelligence primarily through practice, by thinking things through and as much as you can and seeing the different ways in which you think things through, so you get better and better and better at it. But wisdom comes by humility. You gain wisdom by seeking out those who are wise and learning from them, as well as learning from your own mistakes. And when you understand this, you understand what Solomon meant by these 3 points. That is, that wisdom comes from listening to the wise, wisdom is grounded in respecting of God, and that wisdom brings righteousness, fairness, justice, and prudence. So let's look at each of these points one at a time. First of all, wisdom comes from listening to the wise. And this seems to be the main point of the entire treatise, because this is introduced in the book of Proverbs, and the rest of the book of Proverbs is just simply different sayings of the wise. It makes sense that the beginning of the book is trying to get you to listen to the rest of the book. So the main thrust, the main intent of this section is to say, listen to the wise, listen to wisdom, learn from the wise. And you see this repeated over and over and over again throughout it. For instance, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it reads, My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. And yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search her as hidden treasures, then you will understand there is the fear of the Lord. So you get it from listening to the wise. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, hear my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding, for I give you good doctrine. So do not forsake my law. Chapter 4, verses 20, My son, give attention to my words, incline your ear to my sayings, and do not let them depart from your eyes, but keep them in the midst of your heart. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 2, Does not wisdom cry out, and understanding lift up her voice? For she takes her stand upon the top of the high hill, beside the way where the paths meet. The main thrust of this is that you have to actually humble yourself before the wise and listen. In fact, the entire section is replete with these statements of, hear, my son, listen, my son, hear what I have to say. In fact, this phrase, hear, like my son, is repeated 13 different times in these 8 chapters, and it marks the primary progression of the entire section. So why? Why does wisdom come from listening to others rather than figuring it out on your own? Well, like I said before, this is because wisdom primarily comes from humility. We are all flawed, every single one of us. We all make mistakes, we all act foolishly, we all do silly things at times. And one of the mistakes that a lot of people tend to make is they tend to think that if they are an expert, they know everything, or they know what's going on. Or other people think that if somebody is an expert, they know exactly what's occurring. But neither of those things are true. The reason why we have experts isn't because the experts are perfect, or the experts are always trustworthy, or always know what they're talking about. The reason we have experts is because we don't. We are not in a position where we should always be trusting ourselves. We are flawed. One of the things that you often hear is that you can't trust anybody and therefore trust yourself. I do not understand that. If you can't trust anybody, then what in the world are you doing trusting yourself? Why are you an exemption to that? If you can't trust anybody, you can't trust anybody, including yourself. For you are full of error and biases and all these other kinds of things. That's why you need to listen to others. Not because they know it all, not because they're perfect, not because they're the great source of knowledge in all things, but because you aren't. Because you will make mistakes. And you need to listen to the wisdom of other people so that you can learn. So therefore, wisdom is gained by the listening to people who have proven themselves to be wise. And it also comes from learning from our own mistakes. As the book of Proverbs says, chapter 11, verse 2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with the humble is wisdom. Wisdom comes from humility. But folly is intimately connected with sin. For what is sin? Sin is a rejection of the sovereignty of God, and therefore the embrace of the sovereignty of God is also going to be the source of true wisdom. And this comes to the second point that Solomon offered, and that is that wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And the fear of the Lord itself, that phrase means to respect God, to respect his sovereignty, to respect his power, to respect his wisdom, these kinds of things. And this is most clearly seen in chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, and yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, and if you seek her as silver and seek for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright, and he is a shield for those who walk uprightly. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of his saints. But this isn't just simply said here, it's said throughout the passage. Chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my law, but let your heart keep my commands. For length of days and the long life and peace they will add to you. For let not mercy and truth forsake you, and bind them around your neck, and write them on the tablet of your heart, and so find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man. In chapter 3, starting with verse 11, it reads, My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. And this is because the heart of sin, that fundamental desire of us to actually commit things that are wrong, is grounded in this belief that we can decide what is right and what is wrong on our own terms. As if we see the tree in front of us of the knowledge of good and evil, and we pluck it for ourselves and say, yes, I decide, I choose what is right and wrong, not God. I can define nature, I can define law, I can define the Creator, and I can instead choose what is right and wrong on my own. That I'm smart enough, that I'm clever enough, and that I'm honest enough, and I'm good enough that I can just figure it out. But submitting to God is the ultimate act of humility. And because this means that we are pursuing wisdom rather than having our opinions confirmed, it forces us to be humble and to set aside our pride and become more likely to, in fact, be wise. Because you and I would never truly know everything about God. I've loved God all of my life, and I have never stopped pursuing Him. I have never stopped learning about Him and growing in my understanding. And therefore, if I recognize that true wisdom and true righteousness and true goodness and justice comes from God Himself, then understanding those things is a process that's going to take my whole life. Not just the life here on earth, but also the life of the new earth that extends all the way out into eternity. There will never be a point in which there is enough God, enough knowledge of God that I would be satiated, that I will be done. And therefore, there's always more for me to learn. There's always more for me to pursue. And I am constantly aware of my own ignorance and my own need to learn and to grow and to become more wise than I currently am. It is also true that we as human beings tend to be very, very short-sighted. The goals that we have in mind tend to be very physically oriented. We think about our immediate needs. We think about how hungry we are or how much pain that we're in. And we take those properties, those things that we're currently experiencing, and put them above all other things. If I'm experiencing just a little bit of pain, then somehow I'm willing to justify being cruel or mean to the people around me. If I experience just a little bit of fear and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, I may rush out and grab all the toilet paper for myself so that nobody else has any. These kinds of actions, this kind of behavior, in fact, stems from this tendency that we have to think of ourselves first and foremost, specifically in these physical and immediate ways. This is why the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus pushed our understanding of things to say, don't worry about today. Don't worry about tomorrow. Just focus in on what God has called you to do. You cannot control everything. You cannot manipulate everything. But rather, God is in command. Listen to him and trust him and let him take care of tomorrow. Take care of what will happen in the future. And you just worry about what you have to do. And that is a hard thing for us to do. How many of us will sit around the table and argue and debate and claw at each other's throat about trying to determine political questions of which we have zero control? I mean, I may be an American with capacity to vote and capacity to interact with my representative, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to solve the country's problems through the conversation I'm having right here and now with you at this table side. That's not the way in which the world works. And yet I'm willing to destroy relationships. I'm willing to tear people apart just for the sake of such conversations. It doesn't make sense, and yet we do it all the time. But we're not really in command. We're not really in control. I just realized that my microphone was unplugged, so hopefully this all sounded good. Even when we look at the pandemic that we're currently dealing with, there's a tendency that we have to just focus in on how scary it is or how dangerous it is, instead of recognizing that the spiritual dangers that we can have are far more significant, that we generally don't give 2 cents for. But when we focus in on God and we focus in on pursuing him and pursuing his will, we recognize that his goals suddenly become our goals. And our objectives change, and our mentality changes. And suddenly, what seemed to us so important before isn't as important anymore. And what seemed to us to be inconsequential before suddenly becomes the world. And you will find that you will have more joy and more happiness as your worldview, as your mentality, as the way in which that you think expands outward beyond just simply the physical and the immediate. And it goes beyond and beyond into the very realm of God. Now, the first point was, of course, that wisdom comes from listening to the wise. And the second point is that wisdom is grounded in fear of the Lord. That third point was that wisdom leads to righteousness, justice, fairness, and prudence. If you are wise, these ought to be your goals. For if you are wise, your life will in fact end up going well. In chapter 1, verse 10 and 19, it reads, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain, and it takes away the very life of its owner." In chapter 3, starting with verse 7, "Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruit of all your increase, so that your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine." Starting in verse 21 of chapter 3, it reads, "My son, let them not depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and grace to your neck." In chapter 4, starting with verse 10, it reads, "Hear, my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have taught you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in right paths. And when you walk, your steps will not be hindered. And when you run, you will not stumble. Take firm hold of instruction, and do not let go. Keep her, for she is your life." Now, this doesn't mean that you are guaranteed for everything to go right if you are wise. There is a certain amount of randomness. There's a certain amount of fortune that happens in the world. Proverbial wisdom works generally. They do not work as promises, as if you do A, you will get B. However, generally speaking, they are true. If you follow through on wisdom, things will tend to go right for you. And when things go badly, you'll be able to handle it better. And when things go well, you will be able to take full advantage of it. And those things will improve and improve and improve as your life goes on if you pursue the wisdom of God. But if you are wise and seek the things of God first, things will go well. In part, this is because your standards of what is well will themselves improve and be wiser. The things that I thought would make me happy when I was young turned out to be fruitless, turned out to be meaningful. But when I pursued wisdom and sought God, then I was able to be content with things that I already have and be aware of how good life truly is, especially in this country. So as we proceed through Proverbs, or as you proceed through Proverbs on your own, and quite frankly through life, remember these three things. That wisdom comes from listening to the wise, that wisdom is based off of respecting God, and that wisdom accomplishes righteousness, justice, fairness, and prudence. Or, as Solomon says, "Now therefore listen to me, my children, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. For whoever finds me finds life, and obtains favor from Yahweh. But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. All those who hate me love death." If you seek God and his chokhmah, you will not find death, but you will find life. And as Jesus said, you will find life abundantly. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. And may he give you his grace throughout all circumstances of life. In Jesus' name, amen.